What's up, everybody? Today on Universal Theory, we're going to be talking about energy, specifically the kinetic energy and potential energy and that kind of system. So we're going to use the principles rhythm and cause and effect. If you've been liking this new format, let us know down in the comments below. If you have a suggestion for this new format of a topic in science that you're not quite comfortable with, or you are comfortable with it, you just want to see how we'd handle it, put it down in the comments down below and possibly what principles you'd like to see with it, and we'll give it a shot. Mm-hmm. We'll give you that for sure. We love you, the community. We appreciate you. So yeah, we're going to talk about kinetic energy and potential energy. So these two energies are two words for the same thing, essentially. There's a polarity, and that's how I know there's a polarity, because you go from potential to kinetic energy without any break in between. So these two energies exist along a spectrum, and we know energy has to be conserved. In a closed system. We've talked about it in previous episodes. I believe it was cause and effect, probably a few other ones. So, check out our series on the principles if you'd like an in-depth kind of dive on energy. But we'll do our best in these couple of minutes. So imagine a system where I have a bowling ball or a rock, and I lift that rock up, and I'm holding it above my head. When that rock is above my head, it has maximum potential energy. There is no motion. Motion is associated with kinetic. So in the word kinetic, right? Kinetic, you just think of motion. And when you think of potential, it exists within the rock. So you have max potential when it's at rest and not moving. And then when you let go, what happens? The energy moves from the potential state to the kinetic state. So it's building kinetic, building kinetic, building kinetic. You can imagine you flipped over one of those sand or filter things like a timer, yes. and the sand is falling to the bottom. Imagine that's the kinetic the potential energy, and then when you flip it over, that energy is now siphoning into kinetic energy, the other side. And right before the rock hits the ground, it has maximum kinetic energy. And then it hits the ground, and if it was to break, or bounce, let's imagine that it bounces a little bit. Well, that's the earth pushing back on it, and you're going to lose, and that's all that happens. The earth is pushing back on it with enough force for it to lift up off the ground again. And there is some elastic properties that come into play, right? Because the ground's going to give a little bit, the rock might give just a little bit within the bonds, and that allows for some of this energy to dissipate through heat, dissipate through if it was to break, right? Each piece moves with a certain velocity, so that energy is going to be dissipated into each piece as it kind of moves. So that's the closed system. Right, that's what I mean by a closed system when I'm talking about energy. When anybody's talking about a closed system, energy is conserved. That's what they mean is we're not really taking into account wind unless there's wind. Then we need to factor that because some of that energy went to the wind pushing on it. So if we want to find out where all the energy went, in a closed system, you should be able to trace it all the way back.
Yes. And then where did the energy disperse? What other aspects of the environment absorbed it, which goes back into it being conserved. Mm-hmm. So someone might say, well, if the energy dissipated, how was it conserved? Well, because it was absorbed.
Exactly.
Because it's a closed system. It can't go anywhere.
Yeah.
It's trapped. So let's look at potential versus kinetic from a metaphysical standpoint. Let's think about, once again, being and becoming. And like I said, they're on a spectrum, but it's not a gradient where being becomes becoming and becoming becomes being. Yeah. They're all one thing. And then think about how he said the potential energy becomes kinetic, but it's on a spectrum. And that kinetic energy is then that energy that is the potential energy for something else because it's absorbing it. Mm-hmm. So imagine that being, for the sake of argument, we're going to divide them. I'm going to do the impossible and divide infinity. And I'm going to say being is potential. back to QFT, quantum field theory. This is the potential. And then the collapse, the wave particle duality is the kinetic energy, so to speak. So being is potential, becoming is kinetic. This being is always in a state of becoming, and this becoming is always in a state of being. And you have this interplay of cause and effect resembling or emulating the cause, and the cause emulating the effect. And we could even say that it's causeless and effectless.
Yep.
So, but it's this potential always equals capacity or kinetic. And the being is infinite, and so is the becoming. So, in theory, we have infinite potential as well as infinite kinetic energy, because we can get into the Everett interpretation of quantum field theory and the collapse, and how in quantum mechanics you have a specific observation from the potential of the wave.
Yeah, well, it's the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics. But
yes, so in quantum mechanics you have the Everett interpretation. So the wave potential being becomes a particle, and this is kinetic, so to speak. And now it's like, okay, well, if it's infinite potential, why is it one stream of kinetic energy?
Right.
And it's like, well, there in the Everett interpretation in quantum mechanics, you have all of the infinite kinetic possibilities from the infinite potential of the wave. Mm-hmm. So now you have this infinite kinetic energy, which, we're getting into the realm of metaphysics, but it's not just metaphysics, it's metaphysics. Mm-hmm. So it's on top of physics. So we're still describing physics. It's not like this energy that is not infinitely kinetic. It is, because all of the infinite possibilities have to play out, which would be the infinite becoming. This goes the infinite being to infinite becoming. This infinite potential is infinitely kinetic in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and you never lose it. You can think of the yin and yang symbol. You never lose one or the other. The seed of kinetic exists in the maximum potential. The seed of potential will always exist within the maximum kinetic energy. And that kind of ties into the rhythm of what's happening. And to go back to Jordan's kind of point, I think to better understand how there's no cause, there's no first cause, no first effect, is to imagine that instead of holding a rock up, I have a rock above my head and I'm holding it back, and it's tied to the ceiling. That's called a pendulum, right? So I let it go and it's swinging back and forth. And if there's no friction, it'll do that forever. If there's nothing acting on it, it'll do that forever. So somebody could come 100 years later and say, oh, well, this thing has just been moving. And like I said, they'll see it go up. And when it goes up to the top, maximum potential. And as it comes down on a pendulum, it's when it's straight vertical. When it's vertical, that's when it's maximum kinetic. And then it starts to build back into potential and maximum kinetic, and builds back into potential. And it'll do that forever. And that's the rhythm, right? That's the rhythm of vibration. So we can see that through simple harmonic motion. That's what it's called when something swings like this. And then we see there is no first cause, there is no first effect. And you would say, well, what about the person who lifted it and dropped it? And I would say that's a conversation for another podcast, for a long form. That's not going to fit in one of these bite-sized versions.